Diplomacy. History remembers people who build bridges and judges those who deliberately burn them. This is why it's so easy to find busts of Nelson Mandela. He put down the gun and the bomb, and he reached out in ways that his successors have refused to even attempt. They've largely been too busy filling their pockets. Trump's inauguration shows me the failure of modern Britain in diplomacy. Now, to be clear, a British Prime Minister has never attended a presidential inauguration. But they do tend to visit in the first month. And Trump has broken with convention and invited world leaders for the first time. He already knows them, and they're all keen to toady up to Trump. Now, being the first to kiss the ring doesn't necessarily mean you gain anything. I think we all remember Macron's rush to have a bromance with Trump. And it was fine until they disagreed on something. But diplomacy is about keeping that door open, allowing a state where you're welcome if you arrive, where you've had disagreements, but the door does open and you can have a conversation. That doesn't mean you need to agree. That's why Putin and Trump can talk. That's why Rocket Man and Trump can talk. If you can't talk to your enemies, for want of another word, then it's all too easy to start shooting at them. And if you can't find common ground with your allies, then those allies get left out of the mix on things. Whilst Trump dances to YMCA, talks of tapping the liquid gold beneath American feet, and welcomes the world, who's representing the UK? Not the government. That's the point. If they hadn't sent 100 advisors to try and stop him getting elected, and they hadn't helped with funding and messing around, and if they hadn't called him a Nazi, moron, misogynist, psychopath, and whatever else they've said over the last few years, then probably someone from that cabinet would have been there and we might have looked like a world power. Let's face it, Trump loves Britain. He'd love to have someone senior there from Britain. Well, he does. He has the Shadow Foreign Secretary. So the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Priti Patel, gets an invite. And Nigel Farage, well, a lot of Trump's supporters will know who he is. He'll be a welcome attendee, and he puts Britain in the spotlight as a friend of Trump. Where's Foreign Secretary David Lammy? Probably brushing up on his atlas. Starmer and Lammy have been rushing to close deals before Trump is inaugurated. They've been dealing in private, excluding His Majesty's opposition from negotiations whilst he sits round the table with his law school buddy who represents the other side, giving away one of the most strategically important islands in the world to a country with no legitimate claim to it and paying them for it. This betrays ignorance of geopolitics. Oh yeah, David Lammy's the Foreign Secretary. Well, having failed to ram through a stupid deal on Machagos Island, Starmer's tours Central Europe to make a 100-year deal with Ukraine. I support Ukraine and I want them to win. But we would do well to remember that such treaties with Holland and Poland directly led to our involvement with World War I and II. Now, why did we not get involved in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 or the Prusso-Danish War of 1864? We knew what side we supported, but we were not bound by treaty to take part. Why did we not get involved in the Polish-Russian War of 1921? It was the biggest threat that Western Europe faced in the 50 years before World War II. The Russians invaded Poland with the stated aim of taking all of Europe and turning them communist. They wanted to overthrow every country to the Atlantic. We've sort of forgotten it because it all fizzled out and they got crushed in the gates of Warsaw. Lenin was leading a crusade to convert Europe by the sword to communism. We were not treaty bound and we watched from a distance. In fact, if you read Adam Zamiowski's excellent book or watch the film The Battle of Warsaw, the left in the UK pushed the Russian narrative. We didn't really help at all. When you bind yourself to get involved in a war, it's often because it's likely to happen, and a web of such alliances directly caused World War I. Yet Starmer returns from Ukraine with his modern-day peace in our time. I almost expected him to say it. He returns from Poland with a tacky photo from Auschwitz. I know the spot where he laid a wreath, and some people do take selfies there. I didn't take any photos. I was with a Jewish friend, and all I saw was the appalling evil humanity is capable of. I wouldn't want a selfie of that place. It's like Chernobyl as Earth is polluted for generations. Next week, the UN will be marking the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, yet another event Starmer will miss. Back in the days when we spoke of Great Britain, when we were still great, we had great statesmen. Statesman is someone who stands on the world stage and is respected. The Duke of Wellington was such a man. Visit his home in London, and you'll see rooms of gifts from Prussia, Austria, Holland, Belgium, Russia, France. They respected his intellect and his role in the Napoleonic War. There was a museum room where members of the public were welcome to visit. They would stop by his house, come in to pay their respects, and his house staff would show them round the museum room. There was a room where world leaders attended and one where veteran leaders would come and have dinner on the anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo. This is a statesman, a man who commands friendships across nations. The closest he had to an enemy of major stature was Napoleon. Well, never really met Napoleon, despite what the movie might suggest. Then there's Kissinger, who with Nixon formed a pair who could do a deal with China. Would the West have made so much money from China without these statesmen? Would China be vying for predominance on the world stage without this agreement that Kissinger struck? No. It was only his ability to talk to effectively the enemy that was able to make them friends. Tricky Dicky, people might not like him, and it's hard to find anything good to be said about him, but he had one great advantage dealing with the Chinese. Everyone knew how much he hated communists. So when he did a deal with them, people knew that it was a fair deal. They couldn't have a go at him for being a red. William Gladstone, Chancellor under Palmerston, 4 times Prime Minister, and a great statesman. He balanced world powers, supported the Ottoman Empire, reformed the army, held the line on the world stage. He maintained the world he wanted to maintain. Otto von Bismarck, well, cunning and Machiavellian. He turned Prussia into Germany through manipulation, consistent policy, and when he felt necessary, military action. I was sad when I visited Hamburg and found his statue overlooking the Elbe. It's hidden away in a park, surrounded by trees that have been allowed to obscure it as much as possible. And druggies and people walking their dogs who don't realise they're standing next to the largest monumental statue in Germany. And frankly, half of them probably don't know who he is. They're ashamed, not proud of Bismarck. I can list many things he did that were wrong, but he worked in the interests of his state. He worked in the interests of the Germans. He also had no small part to play in the quality of German beer. Well, looking at the last 30 years, it's hard to think of any statesman who dominates or steers world events like these colossi. And in Britain, I see David Lammy, who apparently is going to be Foreign Secretary for the full 5 years. And I heard that he's one of the few cabinet ministers to not have a special advisor. A minnow on the world stage. A great man can make a country punch above its weight on the world stage. Pound for pound, Lammy is probably the least aware foreign secretary we've ever had. I never liked Robin Cook much, but he was a titan by comparison. And I remember he resigned over the invasion of Iraq, which showed a decency that I've yet to see from this administration. Resignations in principle require something they lack: principles. A non-entity can underline the decline of a once world power. Guess which one David Lammy is? Anyone who saw him on Celebrity Mastermind saw that he knows a lot more about Muhammad Ali than he does about Georgian or Yugoslavian politics, even the ones that featured in the evening news in Britain for most of the previous decade. These are things a foreign secretary should know. They should have read up on. By the time I left university, I'd read at least 4 books which covered these, because I'm interested in the subject. We don't have a statesman. We have arsonists who've burned our bridges with the new president by besmirching him. Oh, he's a misogynist, a Nazi, a moron. Labour have all said that. Lammy, Starmer, Sadiq Khan, even our US ambassador has insulted Trump at length. At least he has the gravitas to smarm it a little bit and glad hand and cover that. When you're in opposition, you could pretty much say whatever you want because you're irrelevant. The problem is, once you're in power, you can't, and it's very hard to row back insane political attacks on someone's personal life. World leaders and political leaders have to be careful who they insult. Generations of British politicians dealt with Robert Mugabe, a corrupt psychopath who robbed his nation blind and encouraged murders of white farmers with his racist rhetoric. I'm sure the Queen, Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair, pretty much any of the British politicians who dealt with him found him to be the odious man that he was. Yet find a quote where they called him out for it. They didn't praise him, but they guarded their counsel a little bit. One of the things that divides us from the Americans is that we only say part of what we're thinking. We don't say you're an idiot with a stupid idea, you bleeding imbecile. We say what an interesting idea. That is diplomatic. A touch of subtlety and an implication of meaning, plenty of wiggle room in the middle, and nothing bad to quote. That's statesmanship, and our leaders might have been welcome at the inauguration if they'd done a bit of that. We need political leaders who find compromise and middle ground. If Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley can form a friendship, then it's inexcusable for any British parliamentarian to treat each other with contempt and throw nasty, unpleasant words at either themselves or Trump. Paisley didn't take part at first in the Good Friday Agreement because he felt that they'd sold out to the IRA, and Martin McGuinness was a confessed member of the IRA. At the very least, they both knew people who'd shot at each other, and probably a bit more in some cases. But they ended up as the Chuckle Brothers. They found common humanity and friendship despite everything they'd been through. Why can't we do that? Why do we have to just be writing about how evil and nasty and not fact-based, not trying to be balanced, but just throwing insults at a world leader? Perhaps our statesmen need a statue of the Chuckle Brothers. That's McInnes and Paisley, not the children's TV performers. Because it would give them a valuable lesson about where we are failing as a political class.